Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast about Fun Home, the Family Tragicomic, a graphic novel by Alison Bechdel, which is semi-autobiographical, mostly based on real life, but with a few embellishments along the way. We're going to be discussing the themes and larger context around the novel over the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes. But first, an introduction to our group members. I am Ayush Sahai.
I am
Hi. Yeah, go on.
hi, I'm Koel Rai.
Okay. Hi, I'm Arpita.
Hi, I'm Isha.
Hi, I'm Sankalp.
Before we start delving into the deeper themes, a quick summary of the novel itself. It basically covers Allison's, let's say, complicated relationship with her family, her home, and especially her father, with the context of, let's say, heteronormativity, her own queerness, her battle with her own queerness, and the ways her queerness and her grief for her father intertwine.
Tech in becomes a important factor for like why this is such an important novel, especially like in queer literature, because it's set in a backdrop of a lot of important political issues.
Yeah, definitely. Even though the Fun Home was released and I think yeah, it was released in 2006. A lot of the things that Alison Bechdel discusses is in relation to so much that was happening at that time. Okay, so the Stonewall riots, which in of 1969, began when the police raided the Stonewall Inn, which is the burlesque club in New York City's Greenwich Village. The ensuing riot also sparked 6 days of protests, including violent clashes with police as LGBTQ plus IA New Yorkers demonstrated against oppression. Stonewall is now regarded as the pivotal movement in the queer civil rights movement rather than just rather than only a start. Also, during Alison Bechdel's college education scenes, she is seen reading major queer and feminist theoretical texts, including Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was released in 1971 and published by Boston's Women's Health Book Collective. Alison Bechdel also remembers her foremothers, brave lesbians, 1950s, who wore male clothing despite the dangers that they faced. Now, in addition to references to queer civil rights, Fun Home also contains references to other political events, most notably Watergate, which was a political scandal that led to President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974. Now, the developing scandal and its aftermath are depicted at various points between 1972 and 1974 when Allison is a teenager. Allison even mentions Watergate and Nixon in her diary on a few occasions. Now, coincidentally, or even interestingly, Nixon's downfall coincides with Bruce Bechtel, Alison Bechtel's father's arrest and trial. And Bechtel draws parallels between the public humiliation of these two difficult patriarchal figures. And like this, she does that with a lot of other mythological creatures and literary references throughout the graphic novel.
Yeah, I think I really enjoy how the author uh, basically sprinkles in covert and overt references to both current events and famous literature. Like, for example, the thing that Cole mentioned, the book Our Body Ourselves. It doesn't play an integral part in the plot, yet it does help set up a profile for the author that we can view them through. So now I think we should delve deeper into some of the larger literary themes in the novel.
Yeah, I think like one of the interesting themes in the novel is also how she takes up like a lot of this larger heteronormative, hegemonic like ideas of literature, and like she inserts herself and her father into that narrative, making it very queer. And like the space itself, right? Like at some point in early in the novel, she says that the house is not a real home, but a semicirculum of one a museum. So like she's querying this, she's querying the idea of like this library and museum space itself, like by calling it a museum. She's showing like there's a lot of encapsulated secrets in within the books. Uh, like her own encapsulated secrets and her father's, and also becomes like a museum of memories for her after like her father dies. And
Right.
often like the ideas of like museums are always to represent a part of history that are built on like hegemonic ideas of heteronormativity and queer erasure. So by calling it a museum and like including a lot of like literature in this museum, like library museum, she's really challenging this dominant heteronormative spaces within like even within her own house, because her dad's persona was still for like outside people was still of a very heteronormative masculine figure. And in some in some ways by like rewriting this heteronormative space, um, she's reconstructing the concept of museum not just like in a queer space but also in a very linguistic imaginative manner. And in the same like line of thought, we can talk about like how her own book in certain ways can be said as like a modern queer museum, which like it's an intersection of like visual markers because it's a graphic novel and text. Like even in the like how she describes him and like keeps describing throughout the novel, like the fact that the house is always constantly under construction is also
Right.
like
Yeah.
very telling of like her viewing him as daedalus.
Yeah.
But also is like very the whole point of the house being always under construction is also very reflective of Bruce and Allison's own like queer identities, right? Like I feel like the house somewhat represents Bruce's psyche. Like it's very gothic and like Victorian feminine, like all things that a man in his milieu shouldn't be associated with. But
Yeah.
him as a construction person who like keeps like building and rebuilding this house, um, shows like puts on like a very masculine idea, and like it literally like the house shows his conflict with his psyche. And at some point Allison says that like Daedalus, like he cared more about his innovators than like the people his innovators for. And it's
Yeah.
very reflective in like how he disregards the kind of room Allison wants and keeps just reinforcing how she's supposed to be. Like at every turn, like this construction of the house, it becomes like a reminder for um like Allison that she's not a part like she's not a part of like this narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, so at this point, I wanted to take a slight tangent and discuss in detail how Alison compares her father to Daedalus. So Alison uses basically the two most famous myths involving Daedalus as allegories for what life is like growing up with Bruce. So the first one is that of Daedalus and the Minotaur of Crete, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But yeah, but in Fun Home, Bruce both plays the parts of Daedalus and the Minotaur. As Daedalus, he functions as the architect of this intricate labyrinthine Gothic revival home in which the big tells live, and the wish that he is always like decorating and renovating. But he's also Daedalus in the sense that he's built up an artificial picture of himself as a perfect family man and father, when he's actually hiding what many would consider a kind of monster within his homosexuality or bisexuality, and something that I don't think is given enough uh, attention. The fact that even with all his conflict, he was still a predator. Basically, he was preying on underage boys. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
yeah, and that hidden monster that that is the Minotaur. So I think this is sort of connected to the concept of self-othering that we talked about in some of our class discussions. So I think that's the first myth that we talked about that's wrapped up. And so the second myth, the arguably more famous one, is of Daedalus and his son Icarus. This comparison like bookends the narrative of the book. It's both the start and the end of the book. And yeah, so the myth is a narrative about a parent and a child. But again, Bruce somewhat plays both roles in this narrative. Like just as Icarus flew too close to the sun and like plummeted to his death because of his father's like miscalculation, Bruce had a similarly tragic end prematurely, even though, and it is likely that it's the one that he architected himself. Alison Bechdel also draws a comparison between Daedalus using his son to test the wax wings and Bruce's cold outward natures towards his family and his devotion and warmth to the restoration of the Gothic house. She states at one point in the novel, talking about Icarus's fall, was Daedalus really stricken with grief when Icarus fell into the sea, or was it disappointed with the design failure? So yeah, this again I think leads into another point that she talks about, where she says that she sometimes thinks her father sees her and her siblings as just sets of mechanical hands to hang up curtains and redo wallpaper. Yeah, and yeah, so and at the same time, the final illustration of the book like depicts Alison jumping off the diving board into Bruce's arms, and again bringing forward the Daedalus and Icarus imagery. Yeah, but Bruce's physical presence throughout Alison's childhood and adolescence, even though it was often hurtful and erratic, might have helped prevent her from flying too close to the sun from plummeting prematurely. Uh, Perhaps Alison inherited her father's compulsive, erratic, Daedalus-like drive and ingenuity, but Bruce's fall may have made her able to put those traits to far less self-destructive purposes than he did, such as the creation of this graphic memoir. And this is something that we will touch upon a little bit later about how the novel does somewhat serve as a form of grieving and moving past that grief for Alison. But now I think we've taken enough of a tangent into Greek myth, and we should get back into the themes of the novel.
Okay, so in terms of relevance of literature, I think what Ayush had mentioned at the start, where he mentioned about how how the novel in itself is much more nuanced than any of the other novels that he has read in the past. I think that is very visible when once you start going through this particular graphic novel, because it does use literature and literary text as references for throughout the entire graphic novel. For instance, literature is actually the catalyst that allows Alison to, at the very first place, to describe her lesbianism as the revelation not of the flesh but of the mind, as she says. Uh, at the age of 13, she first encounters the word lesbian in a dictionary, uh, which eventually leads her to get more involved in books focusing on queer figures, which lead her to an obsessive mission to consume more queer texts, such as Morris and The Well of Loneliness. Uh, the very act that we were the very theme or the discussion that we all are delving into regarding how the public private sphere distinction might is one of the central themes of the book is actually relevant to the point of literature as well, because uh, Alison herself, while she uses the quote such as revelation not of the flesh but of the mind while discovering her lesbian identity, that very act of accessing and reading that sort of literature or discovering her identity is revolutionary in nature, and it is described as heedless of the risks. So heedless of the risk, basically identifying that how her discovering of the identity is completely a revolutionary act. The books that she reads over the period of time throughout the graphic novel actually inspire her to attend gay union meeting at her university, and coming out of her in a letter to her parents. uh, as it is very evident, her father is very acceptive of her identity, but her mother is considers her identity as a threat to work and her family, which basically again questions the idea of how nuclear family, as described in the graphic novel, the entire other discourse that how nuclear families are considered to be uh, traditional and normative ideas need to be followed under the whole umbrella of nuclear families comes in, that her mother actually considers her identity as a threat because of the societal setup that they're a part of. uh, Similarly, when we talk about the relevance of literature, except for Allison, even Bruce engages in uh, l- literature throughout the course of the graphic novel. The His engagement with literature and books is actually a sort of an escapism that he uses to express his sexual frustrations and even his subconscious sexual desires. His favorite books, such as The Great Gatsby and Joyce's Ulysses, touch upon matters and themes that are actually central to his characterization. Uh, for example, The Great Gatsby highlights the pains of yearning for someone or something we cannot possess, whereas Ulysses depicts how characters can cross each other's path without affecting one another in a significant way, which is reflecting Allison's complex relationship with her father. Given how closely Bruce's books are tied to his suppression, his secrecy, and his hidden secret, it is no wonder that at the end of the at some point of time, his wife tries to get rid of the collection once he dies. So the relevance of literature is, I think, throughout the course of the book, throughout the course of the novel, and it actually brings out the nuances of the novel very. I think it actually brings out the nuances that Ayush was talking about, and I think it also forges some sort of a connection with between Allison and his and her father. Allison does both of them. We can see throughout the course of the novel enjoy engaging in literature and reading books. Uh, Although she admits her intellectual intimacy with her father is seen unusual to people, she still seems to thoroughly enjoy and appreciate it. And she always wanted to be there whenever she needed it. For example, the quote where she cherishes the fact that he was there to catch when she leapt actually showcases how that she actually wanted him to be there, even though they were not as close or and intimate to the people out of the outside world. So yeah, that pretty much I think explains how literature is central to the entire graphic novel and how it actually plays a very fundamental role in bringing out the nuances that Ayush had mentioned at the start of the discussion.
Yeah, and I think Arpita mentioned this earlier. Uh, the way that Alison interacts with literature is used somewhat as a, I won't say crutch, but rather coping mechanism. I think it like helps her process her life more clearly to just assign it a literary equivalent.
Yeah, and I think in addition to all of the metaphors that we've discussed about the public and the private and how Bruce dealt with his sexuality, I think Arpita also mentioned the house or the library being a simulacrum, and I wanted to sort of delve further into that aspect or that particular metaphor. So I think at some point Bechtel calls the library, says something about the library, and she calls it a fantasy, and that a fully operational one. And I think here the library becomes a space for Bechtel's father to not only pursue his interest in literature in an environment that he himself built and decorated, but it also becomes a space for him to enact upon his sexual desires for young boys. And it is a space that Bruce has created for himself and thus feels in control when occupying it. But also the fact that the library exists within the home makes it sort of a secretive space and adds this another layer of like secret within the house, the funeral home, and it can be seen as a metaphor for the closet as well, that the Bruce occupies, allowing him to escape the home and his family while still sharing spaces with them. On the other hand, in the public space, you see Bruce becomes a contradiction of himself, an appositional character, we can say, There are various examples of this throughout the novel, where Bruce is trying to be the ideal husband and father. And I think an important episode where is wherein like Bechdel and Bruce encounter a butch woman, a woman who is dressed in masculine clothing at a luncheonette, and Bechtel feels a certain kind of joy at the sight. But when her father asks her if that, quote unquote, that is who she wants to be, she's very quick to say no. And I think here Bruce sort of plays the role of a corrective or a disciplining force, and it really influences how Bechtel herself comes to internalize a lot of homophobia while growing up, and again starts othering herself, as Ayush was saying earlier. So, yeah, that was one point that I wanted to add. And yeah, another interesting way in which the novel sort of conveys this idea of the public and the private is through photographs. So there's a two-page spread in, I think, in right in the middle of the novel that depicts Bechtel holding a picture of her childhood babysitter and her father's lover, Roy. Um, and this comes with Bechtel's own commentary upon how her father juggled between private appearances and private reality, wherein the evidence, that is, the photograph itself, is simultaneously revealed and hidden. Similarly, later on, Bechdel also compares pictures of herself with that of her father's when they were in their early 20s. While her father is dressed in female swimwear, Bechdel is dressed in what is largely perceived to be masculine clothing. uh, the contrast between these two people further conveys how they both had not only othered each other, but also tried to live and experience their desires through each other. And especially while Bechtel was growing up and was at such an impressionable age. So, yeah, that's something
Yeah,
I wanted to
I
share.
It's about like the ardent homophobia that like was within the walls of this library museum, and like how she felt more comfortable being herself in a public sphere more than a private sphere. And especially when she goes to New York once and she says that like at 15 she saw New York in a new light. And while she felt so closeted in her own like private space because of her father, she's seeing like more queer people who defined the conformities of gender and even sexuality. She felt more at peace with that, and like she even finally comes out when she leaves home and goes to New York. So I think it's really interesting how like the whole idea of like public and private gets inversed for both of them, and how they keep either like push while like Bruce keeps pushing her back into the closet, she in ways keeps pulling him out of it.
I think, like, till now, we've talked a lot about the public and the private, and we have been talking about not only Allison's experiences growing up, but the political context within which she grew up. And I think that involves a lot of her relationship with the culture that she was brought up in, and that was very much historically rooted in the movements that were happening at the time of her growing up, during her adolescence, as well as her later adult life. Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this one part where Bechdel is describing her father's headstone, which is an obelisk, and she calls it a striking anachronism among the ungainly granite slabs in the new end of the cemetery. So I think it's interesting that she uses the term anachronism to highlight how her father was a man both out of his time, in the sense that he lived his life through fiction and restoration of historical homes, and was also very much influenced with what was happening in his own lifetime, which may have been a source of personal conflict for him. And Furthermore, when we look at Fun Home as a graphic novel, it can be compared to a lot of other graphic novels in terms of how it explores trauma and history. For example, Ayush had mentioned Mouse, and that novel explores the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust and how the author Art Spiegelman is influenced by the lived history and experiences of his father, and how it comes to shape his view on his Jewish identity. Um, so, Mouse therefore embodies what Marianne Hirsch, who's an academic, is called post memory, which is like the relationship that later generations or distant contemporary witnesses bear to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of others, to experiences that they remember or know only by means of stories, images, and behaviors. In the context of Fun Home, Bechdel is the witness who is not only the carrier of this personal trauma that came from her experiences with her father and witnessing his sexuality against the backdrop of secrecy, but Bechdel is also a witness to the cultural trauma of the time that she was growing up in, which included the Stonewall riots, as Koyal had mentioned earlier, but also the Hyde Amendment, which sparked the pro choice, anti choice debate, as well as later on the AIDS epidemic that shaped her queer identity as much as the trauma of witnessing the sexuality of, or the secrecy of the sexuality of her father did.
So,
Do
getting back to the events of the novel, I think I mentioned earlier that we would be coming back to this point. I want to talk about how the graphic novel serves as a form of grieving and catharsis for Bechdel. So, as we see from the start of the novel itself, the author has a very detached view of death and loss. It's as evidenced by their cavalier attitude towards the funeral home, which they dubbed the fun home. And as this funeral home also serves as her grandmother's home, and they spent a lot of time there in their formative years just playing around some with the stuff. Yeah, it became a major factor in how Alison and her family view death. Yeah, so Alison's relationship towards death in Fun Home seems twofold. Though Alison is logically cognizant of and therefore desensitized to the realities of death because of the family-run fun home. When a death occurs, sorry, because of the family-run fun home, when a death occurs close to her, it's even more difficult to process than usual because she is so used to treating death in such a cavalier way that she represses her initial feelings of grief and only lets them out after a long time has passed. Yeah, and I mean, I think this can be seen with the fact that her father died, what, 1980, and the graphic novel was published in 2006. And in seen in this way, the family home also sort of functions as a funeral home for Bruce and the family that exists around the lie hiding his inner truth. As I mentioned earlier, even in the private sphere, Alison is constantly being lied to throughout her childhood. Yeah, yeah, and another example of how cavalier they are towards death. When after her father's death, Alison and her brother John just greet each other with massive, wide, horrible grins, embodying how they're both incapable of showing or perhaps even feeling the typical sadness associated with losing a parent. Alison also suggests that as the person who ran the fun home for most of his life as a mortician, Bruce is even more desensitized to the emotional part of death and in tune with the core realities of death. And it is his job to embalm the bodies when they arrive at the funeral home. And if anybody knows a bit about this, that's quite a gruesome process. Yeah. And with Bruce, Alison doubts the veracity of a famous Camus quote from the myth of Sisyphus, stating, "We all live as if we don't know we're going to die." Actually, in fact, Alison believes that Bruce may have been all too familiar with death, and his proximity to it and his constant exposure to it could have tempted him to cause his own. So, Becca's process of grief is a complicated one, as since the death of her father came relatively early. Uh, yeah, she was almost 20, he was 44, and it is also a probable suicide, although one without a specifically given reason or a motive. So it is a ambiguous loss, as the desired resolution that helps in the grieving process is missing from Bruce Bechtel's death. Because I mean, she always has her doubts, right? She even 20 years later, she can't for sure tell us that yes, my father committed suicide or yes, he died in an accident.
we're gonna wrap this up here. Thank you for listening to us speak, and we hope that you enjoyed this episode. And I think we're going to see you again for another one uh, a few weeks later. So, yes.
Yeah. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Okay. Bye bye.
All right. Thanks, guys.